Tonight's lecture continues the tradition of inviting nationally known speakers to our community, to our campus, to the greater community, and to this region to explore the nature of Christian responses to existing and emerging contemporary issues. Introducing tonight's speaker is Dr. Louis Stulman. Many of the students in here know Dr. Stulman, and perhaps many in the community, I'm certain, do as well. Dr. Stulman is our professor of religious studies here at the University of Findlay. He earned a Master of Philosophy and a PH.D. in Hebrew Bible from Drew University and has done postdoctoral work at the University of Michigan. Dr. Stulman's research interests focus on the Hebrew Bible and the prophets in particular. He has written and edited numerous books, including the prose sermons of Jeremiah, Order Amid Chaos, Troubling Jeremiah, the Abington Old Testament Commentary on Jeremiah, and You Are My People, an introduction to prophetic literature. On the cover of the book, You Are My People, our guest speaker tonight wrote the following. Louis Stulman has long since established himself among our most daring and imaginative interpreters of prophetic tradition. He has provided a remarkable study of the prophetic script as a literature of disaster and survival. And the writer continues, these are among the most compelling words on the prophet I have ever read. The book will reignite interest in the prophets. Professor Stulman has served on the editorial board of the Journal of Biblical Literature. He is General Old Testament editor of the Core Bible Studies series and has contributed to Feasting on the Word, the New Interpreter's Dictionary of the Bible, and the Common English Study Bible. He is currently president of the Eastern Great Lakes Biblical Society. And he is thrilled beyond words to have his mentor, Walter Brueggemann, with us this evening. Please welcome to this podium, Dr. Stulman.
Thank you, Marie. It is my pleasure, and I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this evening. Yes, my friend, my colleague, mentor, Walter Brueggemann. As probably all of you know, Walter is one of our most influential Bible interpreters and cultural critics, the author of numerous books, I think over 100, but who's counting? Scholarly articles, and he's probably the most sought-after speaker of our time. Not long ago, I was emailing a few friends, one in Mount Vernon, Ohio, who wrote back and said, by the way, Walter was on campus last week. It was terrific. And then I emailed a colleague in Rochester, New York, who said, by the way, Walter is here. And then I wrote a colleague in Grand Rapids, Michigan, who said, Louis, did I tell you that Walter is coming this weekend? So I suppose all I can say is he gets around. He is like the Spirit, inspiring us to faithfulness and calling us to live in authentic community. And thanks to Dr. and Mrs. Freed and others here, Walter is with us in Findlay, Ohio this evening. In preparation for his lecture, I told my Jewish and Christian traditions classes, which you should know, some are here, made up of mostly 18 and 19-year-olds, that some of them maybe have not heard of Walter Brueggemann, even though he has influenced their pastors, their priests, their bishops, their rectors, their preachers, whether they are Baptist, whether they are Methodist, Catholic, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Nazarene, Pentecostal, Church of God, whether they come from liberal settings or conservative backgrounds, emergent or traditional settings, from red states or blue states. Over his 50 years of ministry, Walter has refused to be pigeonholed into categories that polarize us, in part, and here's my theory, because I think he picks on everyone equally. No respecter of persons. He understands that the scriptures don't let any of us off the hook. And so, as a prophet in his own right, he confronts us and does what the ancient prophets did so well. He breaks our images, he shatters our idols, he challenges our assumptions, and he helps us reimagine the world under the grace and justice of God. And so, Walter, thank you for the audacity to care that much not to let us off the hook. Thanks for inspiring us to action and for convincing us that words, especially poetry, especially scripture, can break the chains that hold us captive and heal our broken world. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Walter Brueggemann this evening.
It's a high privilege to get to be on the campus, and I am grateful, sir, to be in this distinguished lectureship, and glad to be with Louis and Marie, who have done the detailed work to bring us all together tonight, and I look forward to some interaction with you as we go along. The Old Testament is an indispensable text for the synagogue and for the church. It is a master-defining text for our culture. It is variously indispensable, master, and defining because it mediates and attests the character of a God who is capable of mercy, justice, and faithfulness that issues in forgiveness, generosity, and hospitality, who evokes the world in its fruitfulness and who opens the way for fresh historical possibility. The Old Testament, with its collage of stories, songs, and oracles, reminds us always again that our world is more than a sum of our efforts and possessions. It conveys to us wonder and awe and mystery that elude our explanations and show up in concrete existence. It is at the same time a huge vexation. Any attentive reader will notice that the character of God in the Old Testament is less than attractive, prone to violence that issues in retaliation and revenge. The world that clusters around this problematic God is a world expressed in a rhetoric that defies our usual ways of thinking and speaking, because this rhetoric is filled with disjunction and contradiction and hyperbole. The match between the content of this God and this rhetoric defies both the seeming orthodoxy of the church and the explanatory reason of the Enlightenment. As a result, we are on notice when we open its pages that we have access to a very strange world of imagination. It is this odd combination of wonder and vexation that continues to summon us to the text. We discover that what is indispensable in the Old Testament doesn't fit, that what is master keeps us off balance, and that what is defining breaks all of our other definitions. In what follows, I want to explore that wonder and vexation and show why this text continues to be important to us. And I will do so under the rubric of certitude and fidelity. The gods of certitude are as old as Near Eastern religions. These gods are regularly allied with dominant power, are beyond criticism, mete out rewards and punishments, blessings and curses. They rule with clarity according to requirements and reliabilities. They know what is right. They guarantee predictable connections between outcomes and actions. And such a pattern of domination allows for no slippage, no ambiguity, no uncertainty, and no forgiveness. That is, no grace. It turns out that the gods of certitude are essential as a basis for empire. Empires, I thought of this the other night when I heard us sing during the seventh inning, God Bless America. Empires characteristically appeal to such certitudes as warrants for political power that is also beyond criticism. Thus, the great myths of certitude are hosted in the great liturgies of state and party, so that a necessary linkage is made between godly purpose and political power. That certitude that provides a basis for empire also provides a basis for religious orthodoxy. For orthodoxy is a formulation of truth that intends to silence and eliminate all alternatives. Thus is born an alliance between power, the force of empire, and truth, the force of orthodoxy. That twinned package of certitudes that takes theological and liturgical and moral form takes political form that runs from the ancient empires to modern Enlightenment rationality. The Old Testament maintains a steady critique of such gods, even though here and there this God in the Old Testament morphs into that God of empire. So, for example, we can see this critique of the gods of certitude in Psalm 115. The gods are silver and gold. They have mouths, but do not speak. They have eyes, but do not see. They have ears, but do not hear. They have noses, but do not smell. They have hands, but do not feel. They have feet, but do not walk. They cannot make a sound in their throat. That means they can't go like that. And the next verse says, if you worship them, you will become like that. The long history of imperial religion makes clear that the gods of certitude do not intend transformation. They intend to maintain stability and preserve the status quo of privilege. And I am bound to say in passing that insofar as historical critical study of the Bible is a function of Enlightenment rationality, that historical criticism has also served the gods of certitude by explaining away everything that is interesting, which is why so much scripture study is so boring. In the face of such gods of certitude that occupy the seats of theological and political power, the God of the Bible is a God of fidelity who refuses certitude. It is that refusal of certitude that constitutes the most interesting and the most difficult interpretive problem of the Bible. That God of certitude, already in the Exodus narrative, challenges the Egyptian gods of certitude and invites Israel to exit Egyptian domination of certitude that was organized as slavery. This God, who exercises abrasive freedom over the packaged certitudes of Pharaoh, always wanted to sponsor emancipation from the gods of certitude for the sake of an alternative life. Thus, when David proposes in 2 Samuel 7 to build a temple, God responds to him, I don't need a temple because I go to and fro. So one can see in that little text the contestation between the emancipatory God of fidelity and the God of certitude that David would like to have in Jerusalem. Or in the dedication of Solomon's temple in 1 Kings 8, the great liturgy of the state sang that God had taken up permanent residence in the house of the temple. But then it's followed 2 verses later by God saying, do you think I'm going to dwell in that little house? Not me. Such a claim as residence as is made for Solomon's temple is false, because the God who occupies the biblical text is a God of relational freedom who will not be boxed in. The God of fidelity wills to be a covenantal partner in a bilateral relationship, which means that this God is regularly at risk in the relationship, that this God is sometimes prone to infidelity, because infidelity is inescapably an option in relational fidelity. Thus, the biblical testimony exhibits a God who is capable of a full range of emotional possibilities that run all the way from self-giving loyalty to self-serving pride. It is this God of fidelity who is able to respond to the deepest yearnings of human existence, but who responds in freedom that is sometimes self-giving and sometimes self-serving. It is a primary task of biblical interpretation to sort out the God of fidelity from the gods of certitude, because the gods of certitude always seek to impinge upon the dangerous freedom of this God in order to make God more palatable, more committed to the settled order, and more amenable to the economic political settlements that we prefer. Because the God of fidelity is regularly drawn back into the framework of certitude, I will take some extended time to characterize as best I can the God of fidelity without reference to the pressures of certitude. This God who occupies the biblical text and the imagination of Israel is a God who is eager for relational commitments, but who is susceptible to acts of infidelity that always disappoint. I will identify 3 dimensions of this interpretive trajectory that belong to our work of interpretation. First, concerning the biblical text. The rabbis who received and interpreted the text were no champions of certitude. Rather, they found the biblical text in inexhaustible layers of interpretive possibility. And if you've ever seen a page of one of the ancient rabbinic commentaries, it looks like a complex window screen of Windows 10 or whatever the latest Windows are, with various interpretations located all over the page. And the rabbis developed all kinds of strategies for this. So we come to see, and I want to make these 4 points several times. First, that the text is multi-layered, so that ancient archaeology can dig down into the text, and we have tried to say that in terms of J, E, D, and P, and all these layers that we find in the text. Second, that the text is multi-voiced. So all the text might be credited to Moses, except Moses is capable of narratives and sermons and songs of lament and songs of victory and priestly passion for precision and royal inventories of extravagance and sheer poetic playfulness. And the traditioning process has taken no pains to tell us how these things relate to each other. They're just all there. Third, because there are many layers and because there are many voices, the text is profoundly complex. That is why it is possible in our arguments in the church that everybody can find something they like in the text. It is for that reason that the biblical text cannot be summarized or reduced to a single account, because these many voices and many layers offer a process of ongoing, open-ended interpretation. And fourth, given that it's multi-layered and multi-voiced and complex, it turns out that the text is deeply conflicted. Does God dwell in the temple in Jerusalem or not? When did Israel learn God's name? In Genesis 1 or not until Exodus 6? Is the ground of Sabbath creation or Exodus? Is God present always or sometimes absent? These are all conflictual questions in the zone of fidelity, because fidelity can never be a practice of certitude. It is rather a continual engagement that comes regardless of what the outcomes are, and it is clear enough that a multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, conflicted text will not serve any settled orthodoxy or any legitimated empire. Second, Sigmund Freud, great Jew that he was, took up rabbinic ways of reading the text and used them to understand the human self. So there is a scholar named Cudahy who argues that what Freud was really struggling with in his psychoanalysis was the concealment of Jewishness. So Freudian slips are slips of Jewishness when Jews were trying to pretend to be Gentiles, and they just said, oy vey, whatever that means. So Freud analyzed the human self the way the rabbis analyzed the Jewish text, and he discovered that the human self is multi-layered, therefore depth psychology. So there is an apparent self and an approved self, and he said there is a superego and an ego and an id, and we all know that we are different selves depending on who's in the room. Second, he discovered that the self is multi-voiced, so we don't ever quite get all these voices integrated, and sometimes they speak to us only in the night when we are at ease and our guard is down. So Freud spent a lot of time on dreams, hearing those other voices. Third, he discovered that this multi-layered, multi-voiced self is endlessly complex. So we do not always know what mode of self will come to voice in any particular circumstance. The human self is a rich, unsettled conversation that contradicts the settled self of Viennese society where he worked. And fourth, he discovered that the human self is deeply conflicted, so that psychoanalysis is an attempt to identify and get at that conflict. But of course, that's a very old insight of the tradition, for already in Romans 7, Paul had seen, "For I do not understand my own actions, for what I do not want to do, I do, and what I do not do, I do not. I hate, wretched man that I am, who will deliver from this body of death." This multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, conflicted self lusts after certitude, a hope that is contrasted to our in-process existence. And what the tradition knows is that the truth of the self is not able to come to certitude, even though we may be bewitched for a time by the offer of the empire or orthodoxy with easy offers of certitude in a society without ambiguity. So the text is multi-voiced, multi-layered, complex, and conflicted. The self is multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, and conflicted. Now, third, if we take seriously that quality of the text and that quality of the self, it is a ready move to the God of fidelity who occupies the text and the imagination of Israel, whom we dare to say was embodied in Jesus of Nazareth, that this God exhibited in the Old Testament is no companion of the gods of Pharaoh or the empire of Rome. So first of all, the biblical God, given us in narrative, song, and oracle, is multi-layered. Thus, scholars are able, they think, to trace God from primitive to developed, and for a long time we imagined the evolution of God until God got more like us. But such forms of easy supersessionism in which the Old Testament is superseded by Jesus failed to recognize that all these layers of God are kept alive in the tradition, and all of our explanatory attempts to decode God are futile because this God continues to occupy the full range of the tradition. Second, the biblical God is multi-voiced, capable of utilizing many genres of prophetic oracle and priestly liturgy and royal resolve and sapiential wonder and architectural plans and the lustful extravagance of lovers and storytellers. It's all in the Bible. These many voicings of God cannot be reduced to the package of empire or the package of orthodoxy, because this God always has one more thing to say and one more surprising way to say it. So third, this biblical God is stunningly complex. Just when we arrive at a settled formulation about God, we get another expose. The God who promised to travel with the slaves from Egypt will not let God's face be seen in Exodus 33. The God who delivered the ark from the Philistines will not let the ark be touched on pain of death. The God who is abidingly present turns out to be absent. Thus, Job, on the one hand, can say, "Oh, that I knew where I might find him," and on the other hand said, "Quit watching me so much." Well, he was kind of schizophrenic. Fourth, this God who is multi-layered and multi-voiced and complex turns out to be conflicted. So in Exodus 34, in that great self-disclosure of God, after God says he's steadfast and long-suffering and merciful and all that, yet I will by no means clear the guilty. Or in Hosea 11, this incredible text, God does a rant against recalcitrant Israel and kind of just lets himself go with anger. And then in verse 7, God stops and said, "Whoa, what am I doing here?" And then the voice changes. And God says, how can I do that? How can I treat you like Sodom? How can I treat you like Gomorrah? My compassion grows warm and tender, and I will not execute my fierce anger, for I am God and no mortal. This God in Isaiah 54 can admit having previously abandoned Israel. For a brief moment, I abandoned you in overflowing wrath. For a moment, I hid my face from you. But then the next verse says, "But with great compassion I will gather you. With everlasting love I will have compassion on you." This God who kept silent all through the exile can break the silence in Isaiah 42, for a long time I held my peace. I kept silent and restrained myself. And now I will cry out like a woman in labor. I will gasp and I will pant. So it turns out that the God in this text is like the text and like the human self. The rabbis found the text to be multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, and conflicted. Freud found the self to be multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, and conflicted. And the biblical tradition finds God to be multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, and conflicted. It is clear with this text and this God that we are remote from the gods of certitude. But those gods cannot respond to the deepest yearnings of the human heart, but always collude in cover-up. Such gods of empire and orthodoxy always deny the many layers, always silence the many voices, always pretend that there is no complexity, and run quickly past the conflicts without notice. They offer a beautiful, coherent, manageable existence. But we know better. We know that life is multi-layered, multi-voiced, complex, and conflicted, and no amount of denial or silencing or pretense can overcome that. And as a result, this textual tradition invites us to a different kind of existence. Such an existence will ill fit with empire, will ill fit with orthodoxy, and will ill fit with the technological fixes of capitalist ideology. The alternative is a life lived in risky relationship of fidelity and partnership with God. And I propose to sketch out that alternative God of fidelity according to two texts that I think are so wondrously clear. The first text is in Hosea 2, which is maybe the master text for the subject I have chosen tonight. As you know, Hosea is all about divorce and remarriage and loving a whore and all that kind of stuff. But in Hosea 2, the text is divided so that the first 13 chapters have to do with an angry God divorcing a fickle wife, Israel. It's very patriarchal and sexist about how it presents us, but that's what we've got on our hands. And this God is so angry that this God says, therefore I will take back all my gifts. Therefore, I will end your celebrations. So this big therefore is a whammo. And when you get to verse 14, God, Hosea, the poem says, therefore, a third time, and we now know to duck when you hear therefore. Except that it's a trick. It's a rhetorical trick. Therefore, I will woo her. And it's a puzzle about how you get from verse 13 to verse 14. And they never tell us how you ever get to that slide of grace into new possibility. I will speak tenderly to her, and I will turn her valley of trouble into a door of hope. And then what follows in the rest of Hosea 2 leads up to a wedding vow in which Yahweh promises to remarry the whore. I will take you for my wife in righteousness and justice and steadfast love and mercy. These are the big five of biblical faith on fidelity: righteousness, justice, steadfast love, faithfulness, mercy. It is a huge mouthful. And from the other side, God says to Israel, and you shall know me. You shall acknowledge me. You shall embrace me. You shall come to terms with me. You shall do so because my fidelity evokes your fidelity. So unlike power and control, righteousness and justice and steadfast love and mercy and faithfulness constitute a relationship that has staying power in freedom. This performance of fidelity is not a robotic action. It cannot be predicted or controlled or managed. It is for that reason that the Psalms and the book of Job are preoccupied with critiquing God's fidelity and entertaining the thought that maybe God is not faithful. Thus, the wedding vow that begins gloriously, as it always does, you get the ongoing narrative of a relationship in contestation in which both parties are free in their fidelity. A second text that came to mind is in Lamentations 3. As you know, this is all grief about the destruction of Jerusalem. And in the third poem, the speaker grieves over Jerusalem and says, "He has made my teeth grind on gravel. My soul is bereft of peace. Gone is my glory, and my hope is gone." But then there is a pause. And then the speaker says, I don't know how he got there, but this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. And what he calls to mind is that the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercy never comes to an end. Great is your faithfulness. These are three of the big words of fidelity: steadfast love, mercy in the plural, and faithfulness. So in an acute season of infidelity and a sense of God abandonment, Israel can recall better times. No content is given in this poem to the word steadfast love, mercy, and faithfulness, but we know the content. We know the content about emancipation and food and sustenance and healing and life and birth. And in all of these doxologies that celebrate God's fidelity, life teems with generosity and all kinds of possibility, so that the speaker can say in the midst of despair, therefore, I have hope. To be sure, this fidelity has within it gestures of default. Israel acknowledges that God is not a guarantee, and there are all kinds of reversals, because that's how it is in a relationship of fidelity. There is giving and taking back. There is healing and holding off. So this God functions with all of that freedom and all of that vitality. My favorite is in Jeremiah 30, one of Lewis's texts, where over Jerusalem God says, your hurt is incurable, your wound is grievous, there is no one to uphold your cause, there is no medicine for you, there is no healing, all your lovers have forgotten you, nobody cares about you. Pause. Verse 17. I will restore you to health. He just said you're incurable. Your wounds I will heal. And the reason I will do that is because they said no one cares about Zion, and I will not stand for that. Or in Jeremiah 4, verse 27 says, the whole land will be a desolation. But then somebody, Jeremiah or Lewis or a scribe or God, had a second thought. And the last line of the verse says, yet I will not make a full end, even though I said so in the first line. By the critics, the second line is explained away as a gloss. But if we take the text the way it's given to us, which is a good idea, the yet reverses the no, full, and what kind of a God is that can change course in the middle of a verse? Well, it's a lively God of vitality and freedom. Or at the end of 2 Samuel 11, where David has just gotten Joab to kill Uriah, David said, "Do not let this be evil in your eyes. Don't worry about it. I got it covered." But then the narrator adds, "But the thing that David has done was evil in the eyes of the Lord, for God's ways are not our ways." So Exodus 34 upsets every anticipation of ready forgiveness. So Jeremiah 30 upsets the final verdict of death. So Jeremiah 4 interrupts the promise of a full end. So 2 Samuel 11 upsets the self-serving assurance of David. The text characteristically upsets every settled conclusion, because fidelity on God's part always presses deeper, always presses more dangerously, always presses more intensely. Such deconstructive interruptions attest the freedom of God. It turns out that a God marked by righteousness, justice, steadfast love, faithfulness, and mercy is a God of many possibilities who cannot be contained in our explanatory reason. The requirements of empire and the impulses of orthodoxy want to squelch the freedom of fidelity and eliminate the risks of infidelity. So we fashion ideologies that seek to eliminate the dangers of a life in relationship. We seek to empty the text of risk. We do that by historical criticism. We seek to redefine ourselves away from such risk, so we imagine ourselves self-sufficient and Promethean. And we can cynically say with Sarah Palin, "How's that working out for you?" Or we flatten the God of orthodoxy, thereby eliminating everything that's interesting. My intent here is to insist that all our efforts at certitude require two contradictions that need to be exposed. The first contradiction is that such certitude contradicts the Bible. I know that the Bible is a human document, that it is a work of human imagination. And I am not a simple-minded biblicist. But insofar as the Bible is indispensable and defining, it tells powerfully against an empty text or a self-sufficient self or a flattened God. But secondly, this mystery of fidelity does a second contradiction. It contradicts our lived reality. Because everyone knows that our lives are not lived according to TV commercials, which is the liturgy of capitalism. Everyone knows that the right beer or the right car or the right drug will not yield happiness even if an erection lasts 4 hours. Everyone knows that the huge money on exhibit in professional and college sports is not a model for anything real. Everyone knows that the deep hunger and requirement for a well-lived life is a dialogic engagement in fidelity, and it is for that reason that the Bible is a wonder and a vexation. It is a wonder because it attests this God character who participates in the crisis of fidelity. It is a vexation because it exposes our false hopes for certitude, and it exhibits fidelity as raw and undomesticated. The tradition of certitude only requires reiteration. So what you get from a tribe or a sect or a nation or a party is a mantra or a slogan or a creed. But the tradition of fidelity requires endless, risky interpretation because relationships keep shifting. And so the narrative or the song or the oracle keep making new sounds. That kind of fidelity requires three great acts. It requires the practice of imagination. So Paul Ricoeur has identified Jesus' parables as a supreme act of imagination of an alternative world. The kingdom of God is like. The world of certitude doesn't welcome imagination, and empires do not like poets or artists because they are too dangerous. But the great poems of promise in the Old Testament are all acts of imagination, a new covenant, a new temple, a new Jerusalem, a new heaven, a new earth. It's a poetry. Such acts of imagination anticipate futures even in the abyss of exile. So these acts of imagination are not unlike Martin saying, I have a dream. Second, it requires courage to engage in dialogic transactions with people who are unlike us, which is a huge challenge in our society of fear. The tradition of certitude entertains no dialogical risks, for everything is settled and everything is in place, and it doesn't matter whether you call it fundamentalism or with Justice Scalia you call it originalism. It's an attempt to keep anything from changing in dialogic transaction. But we have always to learn from the Jews, from Martin Buber, from Emmanuel Levinas, from Derrida, or from this woman who confronted Jesus in Mark 7, where he said, I'm not going to share the goodies with Gentiles. And then that strange moment when this woman speaks up and it says, but she said, and she instructed Jesus. She said, your mission is too small if you're just with the Jews. It's in the Bible. And Jesus said, oh, being omnipotent, I never thought of that before. Or the great decision of the early church to admit Gentiles. What an incredible act to allow others first-class visas. Third, such fidelity requires sustained contestation. That is, willingness to stay at the argument that in the Old Testament is carried on by lament psalms. I don't know how it is in your church tradition, but in my church tradition, we never use lament psalms. They would upset the faithful. Now, I don't any church that has ever read out loud Psalm 44. Yet, first you get 7 verses of praise, and then, yet you have rejected and abased us. You have turned us back. You have made us like sheep for the slaughter. You have made us the taunt of our neighbors. You have made us a byword. All this has come upon us, but we have not forgotten you. What do you think of that? And then there's a very long pause in heaven. So the paradigm is the importunate widow. That's the word we use for nagging. The importunate widow in Luke 18. This woman that nagged the judge till she got justice. And Jesus says to his disciples, pray that way. Pray that way in contestation. Well, I worship in an Episcopal church, and the prayers are so nice. I think God must be bored. So the tension that is required for fidelity is this process of engagement that requires imagination. But this tension also concerns theological substance. So Sam Ballantyne, when he finishes his wondrous commentary on the book of Job, says we are invited to wonder not only if Job is fully human at the end, but whether the God of the epilogue is fully God. Has nothing changed for Job or for God? So the reason I began my reflection on the wonder and vexation of the Old Testament is that I have been preoccupied with the account of God's violence that's on nearly every page of the Old Testament. In an orbit of certitude, divine violence must either be denied or regarded as legitimate. But in the sphere of fidelity, God's violence may be treated as a difficult but important theological datum. So I thought first about this divine violence. First, that God is capable of a full range of emotional extremities, as are we. Second, that the God of fidelity lives intimately in passionate devotion, and passionate devotion evokes anger. Third, that the God of fidelity sometimes is filled with self-regard that I will not be mocked. Or fourth, I thought, on occasion, probably it was a weekend, God lets himself go in an emotional binge of rage and wrath. This is a huge problem for us because it's so patriarchal in a society of male violence. But we have to think about this. And fifth, I have thought that God is in recovery from addiction to violence. Finally, I'll be done here in a minute. Finally, I want to say why I believe this issue of certitude and fidelity is so important. I believe that God language is real language that matters on its own terms. It attests that God should not be seen in a mode of imperial self-sufficiency or orthodox certitude. I propose that the dominant systems of certitude in our society want to produce persons who reflect certitude because certitude makes control a primary value. Control through absolutist politics that run toward fascism, and we are on the way to fascism in our society. Control that warrants greedy economics that drift toward monopoly for the few. Control through technological remedies whereby human problems are dehumanized. So it makes a huge difference the image of which God we are made in. The trajectory of certitude finally reduces everything to transactions concerning commodities. The trajectory of fidelity knows that the true values of life are relational. The Old Testament is a wonder because it is a primary witness to relational fidelity. It is a vexation because we always hope for closure. And I believe that the adjudication of these matters is a core task for communities of faith. I believe it is a primal agenda for liberal arts, and I believe it is the primary subject for seminary education. Now, I will stop, and we'll take a little time if you would like to respond by comment or question to see what you may be thinking. So it's your turn. Thank you. You all are like seminarians. When a question is asked, avoid it. Please.
Hello, Dr. Brueggemann. I'd like you to speak more about the issue of violence, particularly male violence. We have all of these news stories and much advocacy that happens in churches around violence against women, but the church is also collaborating and colluding to create violence. So I'm troubled and vexed by some of your words, could you unpack that more? As I'm a pastor, and violence against women is a primary concern.
Well, I share that concern. I didn't have time or take time to develop my thinking about that. I think that we have to acknowledge that violence is all over the Bible, and there are now a torrent of books explaining it away. I don't think it can be explained away. But my purpose in what I was trying to argue is that the church has to recontextualize violence in a context of relational fidelity, and the more we move toward seeing that the Bible is cast in relational fidelity, the more we move away from the categories of certitude. I think that the categories of certitude are the seedbed of violence, because I know I have a right to do that to you. And the church has been doing that to women. The church has been doing it to very many people for a very long time. So I meant to be making an argument that we really have to have a different hermeneutical lens whereby we mount critiques of violence. So I think the lament psalms, not all of them, but some of them are huge protests against God's violence. So Psalm 44 that I quoted is lining out God's violence and say, this is unacceptable. And I think the prayers of the church need to say that to God. Am I making sense to you?
Yes.
I didn't express all that very well, but that's what I was trying to get at. I think that the certitudes of orthodoxy and the certitudes of empire generate violence. So the polls show that our citizenry is all in favor of torture and drones if we'll make it secure, because we are God's chosen people in the world. Surely this must be all right. It's a joke. That's what I'm sorry I didn't say that better. Thank you.
Thank you.
And casting it in categories in relation to fidelity doesn't eliminate violence, but it makes it subject to criticism. And so I think the church, from that perspective, has got to make a strong advocacy against the kind of violence, if it's true that television is the liturgy of capitalism. Television is saturated with violence. I think the most offensive ad I've seen during the baseball playoffs is Rob Lowe selling direct TV and making fun of poor, ignorant people that still have cable. That's violence against poor people. It's saying they're not really worthy consumer citizens. And there ought to be an avalanche of protest to the people who pay for those kinds of ads. I know that the front of violence is beating up on women, but the seedbed for that violence is everywhere about entitled, privileged people having a right to impose their privilege and their values on more vulnerable people. It's obscene. Or did you see the obscene Cadillac ad? I forget, this was during the Olympics. And this very smug guy said, hey, French people are poor people because they take a month off for vacation. But we Cadillac owners work all the time. The inference clearly was that the reason poor people in the United States don't have Cadillacs, they don't work as hard as I do. We have to call out the whole violence system, and we have to call out God, who is, in God's majesty, seduced into violence from time to time. And Israel did that. That's the point I made. Israel did that. Israel crowded God's complexity. But you see, as long as the church pretends that God is not complex, God is all settled, then there's no ground for that kind of engagement. Thank you. Please.
I've always questioned the whole notion of chosen people. I know what the Bible says, and I know there's right sides of what I'm told. But the whole business of being a chosen people, who then in turn do not even recognize Jesus as the ultimate person coming back. He's a great scholar. He's a great speaker. So I always had trouble with that. I don't know what others have, but that's always been a problem for me. So that's why I think the idea of being chosen people is pretty dangerous.
I think the idea of chosen people always leads to violence toward the unchosen. So we're just seeing it in Gaza. But if you read, you saw the Roosevelts, the great, what Ken Burns didn't show us is that Teddy Roosevelt was a racist imperialist, and he believed that the United States ought to dominate the Pacific because these lesser people really are incapable of managing their own life. So U.S. chosenness as God's chosen people also leads to violence. And of course, if you look at the history of the church with the Crusades and the Inquisition, the chosenness of the church produces violence. And I think a little current spin-off of that is the abuse of young boys by the church. Because if you're God's chosen people, you certainly ought to be free to do all of this. There is a wonderful text, and I don't know how it got in the Old Testament, at the end of Isaiah 19, where the poet says, "Behold, the days are coming." I mean, it's going to happen. The days are coming when the Lord God will say, "Blessed be Assyria, my people. Blessed be Egypt, the work of my hands. And blessed be Israel, mine inheritance." Now if you think, my people, the work of my hands and mine, those are all pet names for Israel. And what the poet does is to say, God is going to apply those pet names over Israel's enemies so that there will be many chosen peoples. That is where we must be headed. So we have to begin to think that Muslims are chosen people, that everybody we can think of are God's chosen peoples. So we're chosen people, but we're not the only chosen people. And the Palestinians are God's chosen people, as is Israel. I think that's what's implied in Isaiah 19. It's a huge problem. And we have to think much more about the pathology of chosenness and how it plays in our society. Why is it now that every time we have a sports event, we have to have a military exhibit first? We have to sing national songs celebrating our whatever. It's sick. And it needs to be stopped. You want to say more?
No, I think you just, for me, you outlined the complexity of it.
Yep.
And don't just accept the simplest, best answer.
That's right.
You come up with and say, okay, I'm okay, I don't have to do anything more.
That's right.
It's a never-ending learning process and vexation.
That's right.
I don't use that word.
I don't either. I only use when I have type in front of me.
Would you help me connect?
A little louder.
Oh, sure. Would you help me connect the categories of spiritual formation, categories of fidelity, and reorientation?
Yeah, I could try.
Or maybe expound?
Well, I think spiritual formation is to nurture people into one's true self. And the way I've set it up is that our society wants to nurture us in certitude, but the task of Christian faith is to nurture us to become creatures of fidelity, which means that we are able to engage with courage and freedom and imagination with the other. And I would say that new orientation, if the old orientation is a package of certitudes, the reason our society is in disorientation is that the old certitudes have failed. You can't simply repeat the old certitudes. And I think new orientation will come when we come to the point of seeing that the practice of fidelity is now the way we have to live our life. Does that make sense? You want to say more?
Thank you.
Yes, Dan.
You also, in your book,
because even God had to take a break.
That's right.
You know, and it also mentions that the gods of Egypt did not have the power over the people. But what I was going to ask you is the certitude important. Fidelity is, what about the idea of changing God? You know, what the lecture right now is in the Exodus portion, and Job, you know, and God changes his mind about many things. How do we, you know, the New Testament is yesterday, today, and forever, you know, how do we...
You cannot be faithful without changing. I mean, the object of my affection can change my complexion from red to rosy red. However the other is, calls out for me to be different. Or if you've got a child and you learn how to relate to your child as a 5-year-old, you can't relate that way to that child when that child becomes 13. You gotta find other modes of fidelity in order to be faithful. And so God is underway with Israel all the time, getting to a new place. So I think one of the most pernicious things that the church teaches is that God never changes. You could say that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever in terms of the practice of faithfulness, but it must take many forms. And so God is different to the older son in the parable and the younger son in the parable, etc., etc., etc. And what we have to do in ministry is to say that maturity is not arriving at rigidity. Maturity is arriving at a kind of flexibility so that constancy can take many forms.
The other thing I appreciate from you too is reminding us that it's a living God and a living Word.
That's right.
So that helps us.
So no final answer. Because what the rabbis, what the Jews have always understood, if you have final answers, you will soon have final solutions. You know that phrase? That means get rid of the Jews. So final answers always lead to final solutions of somebody. No final answers. Answers for today.
Try that out on your academic test, right?
Well, of course. Which is what the work is. Back here first, I saw that.
I think you're getting to it, but I know that in the moments of my life when I've been in the margins or when I've looked at a loved one who has died, I find comfort in certitude. Is there a pastoral tension between fidelity and certitude, or is that a false way of looking at it?
Well, I think there is a tension, but I think that the first comfort when someone close to you dies is having someone you trust be there with you. They don't have to say anything. They just have to embody their trustworthiness. And if they try to mouth certitude, it probably will not ring true. So I'm not opposed to all certitudes, but I do think they are quite secondary. Real loud.
You mentioned God expansive language in your lecture, and you also mentioned, I believe, God as a wailing woman and God as a woman in birth. And just being in the church, I've noticed there's real resistance of the church to embrace God expansive language. And my instinct after your lecture is maybe that perpetuates this God of certitude, the resistance to use God expansive language. I was wondering if you could say anything about that.
I think the resistance to many metaphors and images for God, including feminine or maternal images, I think resistance to that is indeed the attempt to maintain certitude. And the great effort against certitude. Do any of you know the hymn by Brian Wren, Call God by Many Names? That's it. What we like is to call God by one name, then we know who God is and how God will be and where. When you call God by many names, it's kind of open and you're not sure. So anybody who says, I don't think language makes any difference, so I'm going to use male language, they know very well it makes a difference. So I think so. And we're a long way from being done with that question. It's very interesting to me that it was exactly in the crisis of the exile that you begin to get more of those maternal images for God. The crisis required new language because the old language of certitude had failed. And I think that's exactly the moment we're in our culture, in which the old language of certitude simply doesn't work. Please.
I know we're all kind of prone to creating God in our own image. And I've seen a quote, I think it was by Bertrand Russell, that seeing God as more of a verb than a noun. Either a person, place, or thing, but basically an active source. And so, could you speak to that? Or is Christ the noun that we can look to? Or
well, I do think verbs come first.
yeah.
But after you do a verb, you have to ask who's performing the verb, and you have to say something about that. So if you say the verb is save, the noun will be Savior. If you say the verb is heal, the noun is healer. So I think we inescapably move from verb to noun, but I always want to begin with verb. I think you're right. John Calvin has a wonderful paragraph in which he says, Christ is all things to all people. To the sick, he's a healer. To the guilty, he's a forgiver. To the lost, he's a compass. And he goes all through that. So that the gospel tradition is very imaginative in finding many metaphors that are resonant with particular human needs and hungers, I think. Our danger is we adopt one of those as the master clue, and that becomes authoritarian, and then you excommunicate everyone who doesn't accept that one, I think. Take one more comment.
Can one discern a direction in this multi-layered, multi-voice, complex, conflicted text without these intercessions?
Yeah.
Can we discern a place where it might be going?
Well, I want to say it's going toward greater fidelity. And I don't think that needs to be supersessionist because that's also true in Judaism. I think we are twin traditions in seeing the movement of the articulate faith in that direction. But it's not simple, linear, and irreversible. Yeah, I think so. Good, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brueggemann. It was a wonderful evening, inspiring, inspirational, educational, informative, all of those things. If you would like to continue the conversation with Dr. Brueggemann through his books, The bookstore has provided some in the lobby for us tonight. So they're available for you, and the conversation continues not only in our memories of tonight, but in the written word as you continue to read the stories, the narratives, the beauty of the poetry that he has given us in his text. So thanks be to God for Walter Brueggemann. Hallelujah and amen.